In late 2020, the stars of EVE Online aligned for a confrontation that would rewrite the game's history. Spanning over 14 hours with the loss of approximately 29 trillion ISK and 257 titans, thousands of players clashed across time zones and strategy forums with the focus of a singular goal: dominance over the universe of nullsec. Breaking several records and bank accounts, this was and still is the most expensive battle in video game history. This is the story of M2-XFE. Let's start from the very beginning, all the way back almost a decade ago with the First World War B. In late 2015, a singular coalition had complete dominance over the majority of nullsec. This coalition was the Imperium, or otherwise previously known as CFC from the Battle of B-Tak-R back in 2014. Led by Goonswarm Federation and its figurehead the Mittani, they held complete control over EVE's north and west and were used in the south as farming and rental grounds. Their influence was widespread across the entirety of nullsec. They were untouchable. Naturally, this led players being unhappy as they were forced to oblige under essentially what was a dictatorship, and eventually a lot of players quit. From 35,000 players logging in per day in early 2014 to 20,000 in late 2015, CCP, the creators of EVE Online themselves, had no choice but to intervene. They announced a set of changes that was going to cause a shift in the valuable regions of nullsec and how the resources in nullsec and lowsec were going to be allocated. As a response to this change, Goonswarm announced that they were going to take ownership of all the moons in north and west lowsec. Furthermore, any lowsec that voluntarily agreed with this plan would have the honoured privilege of being used as cannon fodder and might be allowed to purchase capital from the Imperium for the purposes of them dying in the next war. The major lowsec alliances had been happily minding their own business, fighting amongst each other, but now were under the crosshair of the Imperium. Now, there were a few things that happened in tandem with each other that eventually led to World War B1. The first, some members of the Space Monkeys Alliance, an alliance under the Imperium, stole a considerable amount of ISK from a large-scale gambling organization, I Want ISK. Gambling is now illegal in EVE Online, but back then it was legal to run gambling organizations using ISK or ships as prizes. Needless to say, I Want ISK was not happy, but SMA refused to return the ISK. The second, the Mittani launched an aggressive Kickstarter campaign to promote a book that would entail the stories and glory of the Imperium's victories. An author would come in and write a piece of work detailing how heroic and wonderful their performance had been in a previous war the prior year called the Fountain War. Whilst one could argue that this was a reasonable idea due to the sheer size of the two forces, the Mittani's attempt at asking for $150,000 from the EVE community did not sit well. Furthermore, concerns also erupted over how the money would be managed and the supposed prizes for project owners, one of which was a chance to party with the Mittani himself on a yacht. Needless to say, due to making many basic mistakes of how to run a Kickstarter and how to market it, along with the large disinterest in the EVE community, this failed. In fact, I'll leave the Kickstarter campaign down in the description as it's still up to this day, although cancelled. The Mittani in response got angry and publicly stated that by letting this Kickstarter fail, the entire rest of EVE was killing the game and vowed that the Imperium would take vengeance upon every other entity in the game. And finally, a portion of the smaller Imperial cores and alliances were getting fed up of being treated as cannon fodder from the last war, and noticed that there weren't many things they were allowed to shoot at. They had been secretly arranging to defect to other coalitions or just leave and go off on their own, to which the Imperium found out and essentially smirked at their attempt, threatening them, "Try it if you dare." All of these events happened at once, leading into a revolution. The lowsec alliances merged into a formation known as the Lowsec Voltron, and also merged their separate fleet formations into a massive set of joint fleet formations. This was sufficient enough to overwhelm the Imperium's attempted evasion of lowsec in a few months and push the Imperium back to their border. This success of an operation motivated I Want ISK, more specifically a player named Ironbank, to offer lowsec alliances a large payout if they would continue their assault into the Imperium's territory. A good number of nullsec alliances that weren't involved heard about this and asked if they could take the same offer, to which I Want ISK agreed. Due to being funded by Casino ISK, this quickly became known as the Casino War within the Imperium. The main objective for the attackers was to eradicate the Imperium from their territory, but the main objective for the Imperium was a bit different. In an interview with a fleet commander from the Imperium, the Big Red Boat, He stated that their objective was to avoid fights and simply harass the invaders using interceptors. The goal was to, quote, avoid fights and try generally not to engage with the invaders. Many events occurred in the midst of the war. One of the standouts was Circle of Two's betrayal and defection. Circle of Two, or CO2, was an alliance that was part of the Imperium for years. The Judge, a high-ranking member of the CO2, made a post about how they were going to leave the Imperium due to dissatisfaction of how they were handling multiple fronts of management. As a response, Scion, the head diplomat of the Imperium, wrote a timeline of the period leading up to CO2's defection, which contained a pastebin thousands of lines long. I'll leave this pastebin in the description. The document essentially contains an enormous amount of logs between various Imperium individuals and CO2 leadership, as well as his opinions on CO2's betrayal. Another important piece to note was that around March to April 2016, a user on Reddit had been consistently leaking top-level Imperium information, a user by the name of Illumitani Leaks. It was discovered on April 9, 2016 that the leaker was the director of the Imperium, Lemba, part of Dokdo, a Korean core in Goon Swarm. From the mail he sent to his core, it seemed that his defection from the Imperium was from the idea that leadership was forcing their underlings to do far more work than could be reasonably expected, whilst doing almost nothing themselves. As a result of this discovery, more logs were leaked the next week, which had pretty damning evidence that indicated that everyone in the Imperium existed to help out Goon Swarm. From this, two alliances, FCON and Space Monkeys, left the Imperium. Some of the nullsec alliances that were living in the west to southwest had been infuriated when the Imperium ranted about the failure of their Kickstarter, but had no power to rebel. Now that such an opportunity had opened up, these alliances joined force with the invaders, starting an attack on the Imperium's western flank. The alliances on the eastern side saw this as a moment to join up, and so they subsequently launched an attack on the eastern side. Thousands of high-sec players who had been scammed and ganked by the Imperium over the years also came in, looking for a way to kill the goons. So a new alliance was formed to create space and to train them, to put them into the fight. The Imperium had been saying that the whole EVE community was against them for years, but this was the first time that it actually happened. Half the game's community banded together and challenged their years-long authority. This war lasted for 5 months before Goon Swarm abandoned their northern home in July 2016, retreating to the southern area in the Delve region. What had been the largest entity in nullsec now had their main alliance reduced to only 15,000 characters, but the 15,000 that remained were certainly the most loyal players. They would seek to rebuild their empire, winning battles and settling themselves in Delve. It wasn't until 4 years later in 2020 that the sequel to this war happened. Test Alliance Please Ignore, or abbreviated to TEST, and the Legacy Coalition had been in a non-invasion pact with their neighbour, the Imperium, for some time. However, on June 21, 2020, they decided to finally end this pact. This was announced by Vili, a player who, not too long ago, was the fleet commander of the Imperium. Vili had been a crucial part of Goon Swarm, but his real-life duties forced him to put EVE Online on the sidelines. When he had returned a few months later, his former allies informed him that they no longer needed him. During a Polygon interview with Vili, he stated, and I quote, "When I came back, they were like, no, we don't really need you anymore. So I said, alright, if you're going to ignore the contributions I've made over these 4 or 5 years, I'll go do something else somewhere else. And I'll enjoy tearing you down if that's the game you want to play." They gave the Imperium 2 weeks to make arrangements and to prepare for the events that this decision would inevitably lead into. When the pact ends, TEST would likely be retaking areas that had been denied to them for the last few years, and there will most certainly be conflict. In response to this declaration of war, the Mittani gives his own statement. "We will be outnumbered. We will lose Titans, we will lose Keepstars, but no one can fight a war of annihilation quite like us. And at a fundamental level, no one enjoys it quite like we do." And just like that, war was declared on the Imperium starting on July 5th, 2020, with the intent to evict them from their home of Delve. World War B2 involved 2 massive factions. The previously mentioned coalition, the Imperium, against the Papi Coalition, which consisted of various major coalitions, some notable ones being TEST, Northern, Legacy, and many smaller groups. The goal of the Papi Coalition was simple: to completely destroy the Imperium and to exterminate Goon Swarm from the face of the map. Together, they outnumbered the Imperium by an immense margin, with an estimated 50,000 plus real players and over 100,000 characters. The Imperium laughed at this extermination plan. Their goal was to fight and survive, to, and I quote, specifically force these guys to try to live up to what they told the galaxy they were doing. The Mittani sent for reinforcements, sending an email to every player who has ever been a part of Goon Swarm since early 2000s. You knew this day would come. You knew that you would be called. Only as a last resort, only when it matters most, when the fate of our tribe and the galaxy itself hangs in the balance, there has never been a bigger defensive war in the history of EVE Online, and we're going to win this thing, or lose every last Titan we own in the process. And this is finally where we get to the meat of it all, the Massacre at M2-XFE. The war had been raging on for almost 7 months when on December 30th, 2020, this tension finally came to a spectacular head in the most destructive battle New Eden had ever seen. At this point in the war, Poppy forces had pushed far into the Imperium's region and had begun besieging several Imperium installations. As Poppy pushed forward, they began an attack on a seemingly irrelevant keepstar owned by space monkeys now known as Big Disco's palace. They had cleared the shield timer without too much contest, but when it came for the armor timer, the Imperium supercapital fleet was poised to respond. A single lone Imperium interceptor is credited with attacking the M2-TAC Sinojammer just prior to the start of the fight, allowing forces a window in which they could bring supercapital fleets into the fight for the first time while the Sinojammer repaired. The Sinojammer was then continuously hit by a small number of Imperium pilots to maintain the window open as they brought in more reinforcements. This of course did not go unnoticed, and Poppy had also been bringing in their additional ships. As both sides brought in bigger and bigger hardware in an attempt to achieve a numerical advantage, a cataclysmic battle was on the horizon. As the Imperium forces remained tethered to the Keepstar, Poppy forces moved into a position below the Keepstar and waited in anticipation. Poppy fired shots at the structure, and the Imperium forces broke from tether, returning fire. Just before 12 AM Eve time, the first Doomsday volleys filled the skies. Next, more Poppy Titans, more specifically the ones belonging to the Northern Coalition, began to melt away. The game's time dilation mechanic immediately rose to 10% of normal speed, and Doomsdays continued to be readied for the next 14 hours. Throughout the course of the battle, the advantage slipped from side to side as waves of volleys came through and kill mails populated. At some points, Poppy was volleying 6 Titans per cycle while the Imperium was volleying only 2 or 3, giving a clear advantage to Poppy. However, as the fight continued, this difference was made smaller and smaller until both sides were destroying almost an equal amount of Titans each volley. By 10 AM Eve time, the Imperiums would match Poppy's kills and manage to pull the fight into their favor. By downtime, the Imperium had destroyed 128 Titans and lost 123 of their own, but it seemed the tide was turning in favor of the Imperium. However, despite winning the number of Titan kills, the Imperium had lost more ISK than Poppy. A detailed report of the battle showed that while the Imperium killed more enemy Titans, Poppy managed to eliminate more supercarriers and a very expensive Vanquisher class faction Titan called Grancia Mars Vanquisher, with a value of over 5,500 USD alone. Overall, the Imperium had lost 12.3 trillion ISK to 11.5 trillion lost by Poppy, with an overall combined loss of 380,000 USD from both sides. With no definitive winner, both sides would claim that they won the battle. There was one issue though. Poppy had been successful in obtaining their objective, that is to destroy the armor of the Keepstar. However, they didn't stop there. They kept fighting until the downtime forcibly took them offline. Due to the abrupt conclusion of the battle as a result of EVE Online's downtime, everything had been left in the system but logged off. And it was quite obvious that it wasn't entirely over, as it was clear there was going to be another fight once the last timer ran out. The defenders, that is the Imperium, loaded onto the grid early with roughly 5,000 ships and 700 Titans. The attackers Poppy, however, didn't log back in because they had accomplished their objective, to destroy the Keepstar's armor, and they weren't going to log back in until Saturday, the structure timer. There was a ping from a user called ProGodLegends to Tapi. This is very important. No caps or supers of any kind are to log back into M2-TAC after downtime. Do not fucking log back in. As part of the ping, since Tapi had a large Titan cache and the goons did not, they were going to have the advantage on Saturday as they brought in more Titans. The Imperium set up a hellcamp formation which had them surround the area where Poppy logged off in interceptor bubbles, and camped that spot for days. Anyone who logged back in was killed, and so most of the Poppy Titan pilots did not log back in. Fast forwarding a day or two, on January 2nd, 2021, the Keepstar became vulnerable for attack again, and so of course the primary objective of Poppy was to destroy the structure fully and blow it up. At this point, the Imperium were already set up. They had ages to prepare the battlefield uncontested and move pilots in preparation for the upcoming fight around 4 hours before it commenced. They had full grid control with 5,000 people in system waiting. On Poppy's side, they had suffered a major blow by having their Titan fleet logged and hellcamped. To counterattack, they had been moving ships across to bring in backup Titan fleets. They finished about 1 hour before the Keepstar became vulnerable and had amassed around 6,000 pilots in their staging system and jumped in. But they had made one crucial mistake, a mistake that would cost them very dearly. They overloaded the server. The server was already in heavy time dilation as there were already 5,400 players in M2-XFE local, and by loading directly into combat, they completely crushed the server. What this meant was that Poppy forces would be stuck on loading screens for sometimes longer than half an hour. The ships loaded in, but their clients were not. And such, it was a one-sided slaughter. The Imperium was practically in training mode. Order was called for the Poppy Titans to leave the game, resulting in some of the Titans bugging out and resulting in a phenomenon, Ghost Titans. Their appearance showed an M2-TAC, and the kill mails showed that they were killed, but players have reported that their Titans appeared safely back in their staging system. Out of the 159 Poppy Titans destroyed, 83 were ghosts and 76 were actual losses. Whilst this dealt a huge blow on their forces, the Titans' number was still estimated to be about equal. The Imperium's Keepstar repaired. The original Poppy fleet at this point was still logged off, and so this event led to about 300 Poppy Titans being trapped in the system, being hellcamped. This would continue for weeks, until January 27th, 2021. On January 27th, the following ping went out to test from Billy. This is the Breakout. Log the fuck in. It was time for an escape mission. Test nightmare fleets as well as other Poppy subcapitals were clearing anchored bubbles and shooting interdictors, while Poppy supercarriers and carriers were engaging Imperium carriers on their Keepstar. The supercapitals were starting to log in and jump out in a steady stream. The Imperium started to ping for reinforcements and was soon jumping in their Titan fleet to kill as many escaping Poppy supers as they could. The Imperium got 5 supers before they were interrupted by a Poppy Dreadbomb fleet siloing in on their fleet and damaging their supercapitals. 6 Imperium Titans died to the Dread Bombs as they were forced to shift their attention to the Dreads instead of focusing on escaping Poppy supers. And well over 100 Poppy supercapitals successfully escaped the hellcamp as the Imperiums were occupied with the Dreads. And that would mark the end of this historic battle at M2-TAC. World War II, however, would rage on, entering a much slower phase, resulting in the long siege of 1DQ1 TAC-A. But that's a story for another day. This battle dwarfed previous records held by the Bloodbath of BTAC-R in all manners imaginable. The Battle of M2-TAC had approximately lost 29 trillion ISK compared to BTAC-R's 10.5 trillion, costing 80,000 more USD. Out of the 1,304 Titans that participated in the fight, 257 of them were destroyed, amounting to nearly a 20% Titan kill rate. When comparing this to the previous record of 74, the damage isn't even comparable. To commemorate this historical event, a special monument had been constructed in M2-TAC. From the words of the designer, a diorama inside a semicircle with ships ready for battle on its 2 opposite sides, and a banner in the middle bearing the records of all players involved in the fight. I wanted something majestic and imposing to represent the epic scale of the battle. A beautiful structure built out of obsidian-esque shiny black stone. The central complex contains a series of interlocking towers that span from the central axis along a graceful curve, and in the center, small balls of light are constantly flying around, serving as a constant reminder to the fateful events of that day. This was the Battle of M2-TAC-XFE. Thank you for watching.